Well, federal Judge Boardman's not going to be happy with the new filing by the Trump administration about the removal and deportation of babies. And I'm not happy either, but I'm going to report on it right now. What is it with this administration? They just won't comply with federal court orders. And I've got yet another example in my hand. Here's what happened. Last Friday on the last gasp, but I mean that literally of the Supreme Court rulings, they dropped the one we were waiting on, the Birthright citizenship context one, where they took away the Supreme Court's 6-3 MAGA majority, the right for federal judges that they've had for decades to issue nationwide injunctions about things like constitutional violations that are nationwide in their injury. But federal judges now, except under very narrow, limited circumstances that the Supreme Court couldn't even put into writing, aren't going to have that ability anymore. So they sent all these 3 major cases about birthright citizenship back to the respective judges with instructions effectively by Kavanaugh and Sotomayor that if you're going to try to defend birthright citizenship and babies who were born since February 25th, when Donald Trump's depraved executive order was issued all the way through now and in the future, if you're trying to protect them, get on your horse file a class action lawsuit to define as the class all of the people that are who will be injured by the executive order being enforced, meaning the mothers and the babies and the rest. And that's exactly what several groups did. One up in New Hampshire and one in front of Judge Boardman in Maryland in a case we call CASA Incorporated. So what's the deal? I've got the latest documents in my hand and I'm breaking it down for you. Last Friday, right at the 11th hour, the Supreme Court dropped a bombshell ruling that we've all been waiting on. This was about birthright citizenship, and with a 6-3 MAGA majority, they stripped federal judges of a power they've held for decades, the ability to issue nationwide injunctions on constitutional violations that impact people across the country. Now, unless there are very narrow, specific circumstances, which, by the way, the Supreme Court couldn't even clearly define in writing, federal judges are out of luck on this front. They sent 3 major birthright citizenship cases back to the lower courts with Justices Kavanaugh and Sotomayor basically saying, hey, if you want to protect these babies born after Trump's executive order on February 25th, you better saddle up, file a class action lawsuit, and define the class as everyone harmed by this order. Moms, babies, the whole lot. And that's exactly what some groups did. Up in New Hampshire and right here in Maryland, in front of Judge Boardman, in a case we're calling CASA Incorporated, they've taken action. Judge Boardman held a hearing just yesterday, and let me tell you, she's worried, really worried about these babies being removed and deported. She's got a briefing schedule set for class action certification because, of course, there's a process to follow. Rule 23 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure lays it out. There's got to be briefs, arguments, and checks on a bunch of boxes. Naturally, the Trump administration is going to fight this tooth and nail, so she's got a hearing scheduled for July 27th, but here's the kicker. She's concerned that between now and then, the administration might just start deporting these babies. During the hearing, she straight up asked the administration's lawyer, Brad Rosenberg, to look her in the eye and tell her if they're planning to do this. His answer, no. But let's be real here. No federal judge, including Judge Boardman, can take anything this administration or the Department of Justice says at face value. There's just no credibility left. Not with Donald Trump pulling the strings, not with Pam Bondi at the helm of the DOJ, and certainly not with folks like Amal Boy, the number 3 at DOJ, who, get this, was caught in a whistleblower letter telling immigration unit lawyers to straight up lie to federal judges, ignore their orders, and use some pretty colorful language I can't repeat on air. So pardon me for being skeptical, but can you blame Judge Boardman for not buying what Rosenberg is selling? I mean, other judges have been lied to as well. According to whistleblower Drew Ainen, who hasn't been seen in recent court appearances, judges like Zenas and Boasberg have been fed false info on related removal and deportation cases. So why on earth would Judge Boardman trust a verbal no in her courtroom? She wasn't having it. She ordered the government to submit their position in writing by today, specifically on whether they're planning to deport babies behind her back while she's still ruling on the class action certification. She also wanted clarity on whether they're going to act now, especially since there's no proper injunction in place after the Supreme Court basically gutted the existing ones and told judges to reassess their scope. We're in this weird limbo period right now, a purgatory for these babies and their families, where enforcement could technically happen at any moment. Now, what the government could have done is simple. They could have submitted a short, clear statement saying, We agree not to remove or deport babies during this interim period between now and the court's ruling on class action certification or the pending motion for a temporary injunction. Boom. 2 lines. Done. I just wrote it for them. But nah, that's not what we got. Let me read you what they actually filed. This is straight from their submission yesterday in response to Judge Boardman's order to clarify their stance by noon on Tuesday, July 1st, about what actions the U.S. may or may not take under Trump's executive order between now and July 27th. Here's their statement defendants submit as follows. Okay, this is where they're supposed to reassure the judge, right? Maybe say we won't deport babies. Nope. Instead, they go on June 27th, the Supreme Court granted the following partial stay of this court's preliminary injunction, and then they quote the Supreme Court's Friday decision. It's a short paragraph saying the government's application to partially stay the preliminary injunctions is granted, but only to the extent that the injunctions are broader than necessary to provide complete relief. So, there's an argument that some form of injunction is still in place, it's just been scaled back. But does that give any real protection? I'm not so sure. Next paragraph from the Trump administration, signed by Brad Rosenberg himself, under the Supreme Court stay, July 27, 2025, which is the date the judge is holding a hearing on briefing about whether she's going to certify the class, is the earliest date on which defendants may begin to apply Executive Order 14160 to persons covered by the order. Still not feeling reassured here, are you? Then they throw in, however, the executive order also provides for a 30-day ramp-up period. The court's stay thus allows defendants to immediately begin to develop and issue public guidance about the executive plan to implement. Now you could read this as them needing 30 more days after July 27th to actually start implementing, but I'm not seeing a hard commitment here. That ramp-up period could be happening right now for all we know. So this filing, it's not comforting in the slightest. If I were Judge Boardman, I'd be calling the parties back into my courtroom and saying, listen, I don't know why this is so hard. I asked for a straight answer, will you or won't you deport babies between now and July 27? Instead, I got a bunch of legal mumbo-jumbo, cut-and-paste quotes from the Supreme Court, and vague talk about a 30-day ramp-up and the earliest date you might start removing people. That doesn't give me any peace of mind. And here's why she's got to be on high alert, because this administration can't be trusted. If I were in her shoes, I'd be using my equitable authority to speed things up. I'd issue a temporary restraining order right now, provisionally certify the class, and slap a TRO on this to ensure no babies are removed until I've had the chance to make a final decision on class action certification and issue a preliminary or permanent injunction. That's the only way to protect these vulnerable families during this uncertain period. Why does Judge Boardman care so much? Because she's seeing through the nonsense in this filing. It sounds like the Trump administration is saying the earliest they can start deportations is July 27th, but I'm not even sure she'll have everything wrapped up by then. If I were her, I'd take preemptive action to make sure no one slips through the cracks. A temporary restraining order now would be a safeguard, a prophylactic measure to keep these babies safe until the legal dust settles. And let me tell you, this isn't just about one judge or one case. This is about an administration that's repeatedly shown it won't comply with court orders, that's eroded trust with federal judges across the board. The Department of Justice under this leadership has lost all credibility. When you've got whistleblowers exposing lies to judges, when you've got top officials allegedly telling lawyers to defy court orders, how can any judge or any of us take their word for anything? It's a sad state of affairs, folks. Now let's zoom out for a second and talk about what this executive order even means. Since February 25th, when Trump issued this order, we've been in uncharted territory. Birthright citizenship, a cornerstone of American law under the 14th Amendment, is under attack. This order essentially says that babies born on U.S. soil to certain parents, often undocumented immigrants, don't automatically get citizenship. And worse, it opens the door to their removal along with their families. We're talking about infants, here newborns, who've done nothing wrong except be born into a system that's now targeting them. It's heartbreaking, and it's why groups in New Hampshire and Maryland are fighting tooth and nail to get class action status to protect as many people as possible under one legal umbrella. But the Supreme Court's ruling last Friday threw a wrench into everything. By limiting nationwide injunctions, they've made it harder for judges like Boardman to issue broad protections. Now it's a case-by-case slog, with each judge having to narrowly tailor their rulings to the specific plaintiffs in front of them. That's why the class action certification is so critical. It's a way to define a large group of affected people, moms, babies, families, and get them under the court's protection all at once. Without that, you've got piecemeal rulings and potentially thousands of families falling through the cracks while the legal battles play out. And let's not forget the timing here. We're in this twilight period, as I called it earlier, where the old injunctions have been stayed or scaled back by the Supreme Court, and new ones haven't been fully put in place yet. It's a dangerous window for enforcement. The Trump administration could, in theory, start acting on this executive order at any moment unless a judge steps in with a new order or injunction. That's why Judge Boardman is pushing so hard for clarity from the government, and why she's likely frustrated with the vague, non-committal response she got. I've got to say, reading through this filing, it feels like the administration is playing games. They're not giving a straight answer because they don't want to be pinned down. They're quoting Supreme Court language and tossing in phrases like earliest date and ramp-up period to create ambiguity. But ambiguity in a situation like this is dangerous. We're talking about human lives, tiny, vulnerable lives. A federal judge shouldn't have to play detective to figure out what the government's intentions are. They should just say it plain and simple: we won't deport anyone until this court rules. But they didn't? And that speaks volumes. So what happens next? I think Judge Boardman's going to take matters into her own hands. She's got the authority to issue a temporary restraining order, and I'd bet she's considering it right now. She could provisionally certify the class even if it's just a temporary step to make sure no one gets deported, while she works through the full certification process and hears arguments on a preliminary injunction. That's the safest bet to protect these babies and their families. And honestly, given the track record of this administration, it's probably the only way to ensure they don't pull a fast one behind her back. I'm also keeping an eye on the July 27th hearing. That's the deadline she's set for arguments on class certification, but as we've seen, a lot can happen between now and then. If the administration's filing is any indication, they're not going to make this easy. They're likely to keep pushing the boundaries, testing how far they can go without a firm court order stopping them. And that's why I think Judge Boardman might act sooner rather than later. She's not going to wait until the 27th to see if they start rounding up families. Let me take a step back and give you some context on why this matters so much. Birthright citizenship, or jus soli, as it's called in legal terms, has been a fundamental principle in the U.S. since the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. It says that anyone born on U.S. soil is a citizen regardless of their parents' status. It's a bedrock of our identity as a nation of immigrants. But Trump's executive order challenges that, directly arguing that the government can exclude certain babies from citizenship based on their parents' immigration status. Legal scholars are divided on whether an executive order can even override a constitutional amendment. Most say it can't, and it'll take a full constitutional amendment to change this. But in the meantime, while the courts hash it out, families are caught in the crossfire. And let's talk about the human cost here. Imagine being a parent giving birth to a child in the U.S. thinking they're safe under the law, only to find out that the government might come for your baby. These are real people, real families, facing unimaginable stress and fear. Some of these babies are just days or weeks old. The idea of deporting them, separating them from their families, or sending them to countries they've never known is not just cruel, it's inhumane. That's why Judge Boardman and others are fighting so hard to put protections in place. They see the stakes, and they're not going to let bureaucracy or legal games stand in the way of justice. Now I've got to address the elephant in the room: trust. Or rather, the complete lack of it. The Trump administration and the Department of Justice have burned so many bridges with the judiciary, it's a wonder they've got any credibility left at all. When you've got whistleblowers like Drew Ennin coming forward with evidence of DOJ officials, instructing lawyers to lie to judges to ignore court orders, and to basically thumb their nose at the rule of law, how can anyone believe a word they say? And it's not just one rogue actor, according to reports. This goes all the way up to the top, with figures like Amil Boy allegedly involved. Add to that the fact that Trump himself has repeatedly called the shots, undermining judicial independence, and you've got a recipe for chaos. Federal judges are fed up, and Judge Boardman is no exception. So where do we go from here? I'm going to be following this case closely, and I'll bring you updates as soon as they happen. If Judge Boardman issues a temporary restraining order, you'll hear it from me first. If the administration tries to pull something sneaky before the July 27th hearing, I'll be on it. And if there's any movement on the broader fight for birthright citizenship, whether in Maryland, New Hampshire, or at the Supreme Court level, I'll keep you in the loop. This is a story about more than just legal jargon. It's about the lives of the most vulnerable among us, and I'm committed to shining a light on it. Before I wrap up, I want to give a shout out to the folks at the Midas Touch Network, where I'll be breaking down stories like this every week. You can catch me on Legal AF, our podcast, Wednesdays and Saturdays at 8:00 p.m. Eastern Time. And I've got a brand new show on Tuesdays at 8:00 p.m. Eastern called The Intersection with Michael Popak right here on Midas Touch. Hit that subscribe button on YouTube, join the community, and stay tuned for all things legal and political. We've got a lot to unpack, and I'm here to walk you through it. I also want to take a quick moment to mention something personal. I've recently started my own law firm, the Popak Firm, to help folks with catastrophic injury cases, think car accidents, trucking collisions, medical malpractice, negligence, and wrongful death. If you or someone you know has a case like this, give us a call for a free consultation. Check out thepopakfirm.com or call 1-877-POPOK-AF. I'm passionate about fighting for justice, whether it's in the courtroom or here on the airwaves, and I'm proud to be taking on this new chapter. All right, folks, that's all for now. This is a developing story, and I'll be back with more as soon as there's an update on Judge Boardman's next move or the Trump administration's response. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and let's keep pushing for what's right. This is Michael Popak signing off.